Alrighty, welcome. My name is Stephen Smith. I'm the founder and CEO of NOCD. I'm also here with Dr. Patrick McGrath, Dr. Jamie Feusner, and Kimberly Quinlan,
Hello.
who are all OCD specialists. And we're really excited today to talk about OCD treatment from a clinician's perspective, largely because we know that OCD can be complicated, but we have incredible experts out there who specialize in treating it and getting people proper care. So thank you all for joining us. And also thank you for Made of Millions for hosting this webinar. Made of Millions is an incredible organization that brings people with all types of mental illnesses treatment. And it's run by Aaron Harvey, who's an incredible advocate for mental health awareness as well as for OCD. So thank you for Made of Millions again. And I'd love to open up by having Dr. McGrath. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Patrick McGrath. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been treating anxiety disorders and OCD for the past 20 years, starting with a postdoctoral fellowship at the St. Louis Behavioral Medicine Institute. I've opened up 2 intensive outpatient programs, a partial hospital program, and a residential treatment program for anxiety, OCD, and also for co-occurring substance use. And my take on OCD and really focus in treatment and therapy is on really helping people design good exposure and response prevention treatments. How do we not only get people to be exposed to things they're afraid of, because that happens on a daily basis, but how do you take advantage of those events and really utilize response prevention? How do you get people to stop doing the typical safety-seeking behaviors that they normally do? And for me, I'm always looking at avoidance, reassurance, distraction, substance use, and compulsions. Those are the 5 things that I focus on. I mean, sometimes people can ask me, what do I do? I could say I'm head of clinical services for NOCD, or I could also say I help people stop doing safety behaviors all day long so that they can learn to sit with the things that are uncomfortable in their life and learn that they can handle those things without having to do something for an immediately gratifying experience, but really work toward the long-term, what's going to be best for me later. So I often say to my patients, let's not apply a short-term fix to a long-term problem. Let's look at a long-term fix for a long-term problem. And let's really get people to sit with that discomfort and learn, I can handle it. I may not like it. It may not be comfortable, but I can handle it. And in my work with the International OCD Foundation as a scientific advisory board member, and I'm the president of OCD Midwest here, we even try to do that here in the local area as well too, with advocacy and walks and all those types of things, constantly getting people to think in terms of how can you face your fears and not let them overwhelm your life.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And do you mind telling the audience how long you've been treating OCD?
20 years.
Wow. Awesome. So very, very experienced. Thank you.
I know I don't look that old, but it's true. I have 20 years.
Thank you. And Kim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Kimberly Quinlan. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California. I am an OCD specialist and an eating disorder specialist. I do a lot of work with sort of the co-occurring disorders there. I have a private practice in Calabasas where I see mostly OCD, BFRBs, and eating disorders, as we were talking about before. But in addition to that, my passion is to bring some light and joy to some people as they go through that process. And in addition, really try to just give them as many tools as they can. So the point of my career that I had a little bit of a crisis was that I was providing one-on-one treatment with people and really feeling terrible about the fact that I wasn't providing any treatment for people who don't have access to treatment. And so from that moment of sadness, I created a podcast, Your Anxiety Toolkit. And ultimately the goal of that and all of the other things that I do is to, again, create and give you tools to help manage what can be a very isolating and distressing disorder. I love what I do. The biggest message that I try to share is this idea that it's a beautiful day to do hard things. most of the time when I see a patient or a client come to my office, they've convinced themselves that they can't do hard things because they've had such a hard time doing hard things. And so my goal is to empower people to know that every day is a beautiful day to do hard things. And there are tools you can use to help you do those hard things. And hopefully we can have, just like today, people have more access to those tools, whether they're in an area where there is resources or not.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kim. And I think one of the things that stands out about Kim is how much work she does also on Instagram and social media and drawing awareness for OCD and other conditions. And so, and Kim, what's your Instagram handle again?
Kimberly Quinlan.
Kimberly Quinlan. And
Yeah.
so it's a great account if you have a chance to follow. It's one of my favorites. So it's really, really great. And Dr. Feusner, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Jamie Feusner, and I'm a psychiatrist by training. I'm a professor of psychiatry at UCLA. I'm the director of our adult OCD program there. So I did training in psychiatry, and I did 2 fellowships. I did a fellowship in psychopharmacology, and then a fellowship in neuroimaging research. And as part of the director of the OCD intensive treatment program, then I've been the director since 2006. And we have a program where we do intensive exposure and response prevention, and it's a comprehensive program. We also do medication management as well. And I'm also the chief medical officer at NOCD. So I treat a variety of patients. I treat patients with OCD, also body dysmorphic disorder, which is an obsessive compulsive and related disorder, are kind of 2 of my major both research and kind of clinical specialties. And I also do research on people with eating disorder, anorexia nervosa specifically, and gender dysphoria. So the way that I think about treatment in a very broad way, because there are many different people with different degrees of symptoms, different types of symptoms, comorbidities. Depression is really common in OCD. And so I think about treatment from many different angles. So from a psychopharmacology or medication angle, from exposure and response prevention, of which I've had many years of experience. I've also treated patients for about 20 years now as well. And I'm very familiar with it because I actually do it myself. So I have my own patients that I treat with exposure and response prevention, as well as I oversee therapists in our program, and I teach psychiatry residents how to do exposure and response prevention and CBT in general. So I treat my own OCD patients and body dysmorphic disorder patients primarily, and some of them I do medication management, some of them do exposure and response prevention, some of them I do both. So I really think about issues having to do with kind of how you integrate different types of treatments, like medications and exposure and response prevention, when you might think about doing one, starting with the other, what is the timing of it, what medications can maybe help, or what medications might hinder exposure and response prevention. And then even beyond that as well, so other types of treatments, like more recent neuromodulation treatments, sometimes called neurostimulation, like transcranial magnetic stimulation and deep brain stimulation, which are both types of treatments that we offer also at UCLA. So I'm also a board member of the International College of Obsessive Compulsive Spectrum Disorders, and I'm also on the scientific and clinical advisory board of that International OCD Foundation as well. So I try to keep up to date as much as possible with developments, around the world in terms of research, as well as clinical treatments having to do with OCD.
Great. Thank you. Well, it's very clear that everybody here on this panel, all 3 of you are incredible OCD specialists. You all have your own kind of passions within the OCD community, right? With how you draw awareness, the items you research, the different sectors of OCD that you treat, but I think in the general sense, each of you has a really strong passion for helping people, right? Broadly, and that's what's really exciting. So today, our goal is to really talk about the ins and outs of OCD treatment and to answer each of the audience members' questions, right? So we could understand as a community, really, what do we need to do to go access treatment? And we also can understand what's evidence-based, what isn't. And I know there are a lot of different questions out there because, quite frankly, there's a lot of a lot of chatter out there, right? People oftentimes will say, well, hey, I tried this one essential oil and it worked really well. Well, does that actually follow the research? Does it not? Our goal today is to kind of draw clarity to a lot of those questions, so that way people can go and access effective treatment. And so we are very fortunate where we have a lot of different perspectives. All three of our panelists today have written great blogs, great books even. They've done a lot of great work themselves. They've opened up different practices. So it's really a special group. And so just people also that I look up to, friends of mine. So I've gotten to know both, I've got to know Kim, got to know Dr. McGrath, Dr. Feusner here for the last several years, and couldn't be more appreciative to have their time today. So to kick things off, any questions from the audience to start? So I know we have one from Yelly 1978 who asks, can OCD go into remission? So would anybody like to answer that question?
Well, I'd say this, that you can really do some excellent therapy and get yourself to a point that OCD doesn't have a significant impact on your life anymore, where it will be in the background, but it doesn't have to be interfering on a daily basis. And to me, that's what I would really look at as what we would call a remission of your OCD. We're not going to say that we're curing OCD. We're not going to say it's never going to pop up again. And we're not going to say you're never going to have an intrusive thought or image or urge. And you may still practice response prevention on a daily basis to make sure that you're maintaining your gains, but you can do that and have a very effective and productive life.
Yeah. Kim or Jamie, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's the term remission. So I think it's good to think about what that means. And just like Patrick said, I think remission, most clinicians define remission as being very low symptoms. So most likely not zero, but very, very low symptoms. It can be close to zero. It can be zero at some times in their life. And what that means practically is that a person can go for long periods of time, maybe without having anything kind of trigger them, but once in a while something might trigger them a little bit, but then they know exactly how to deal with it right then and there so that it doesn't spiral. They know how to do response prevention, and it can just have, very minimal or just pretty close to zero impact on their life, and they can function as they want to function.
Definitely.
No, I would just back what both of them they've said. The thing that I find a lot, and I get this question really often, particularly in the social media space, and the way I answer it is really to look at how we define remission and how we define the word recovery, because that's also a question that often gets sort of misused. So I agree with Patrick and Jamie in that they're saying that you can be in recovery with OCD and have full functioning, have joy in your life, be able to, do the things that you love to do. But that doesn't mean there's an absence of thoughts. And I think that's the main thing that people I know often get they're misunderstood on, is this idea that in recovery, life doesn't have any anxiety. And so that's the only real tweak I used to have to make when people sort of make that question.
Great, thank you. I think it's, I know this is obviously from the clinical perspective today, but, I think as someone who lives with OCD too, you always are going to have thoughts, right? And it's just a matter of how you manage them and how you respond to them. So I think, once you get to a point where you learn how to accept uncertainty, the thoughts just kind of pass in and out, and you feel like you once did prior to having OCD, which is really exciting. So as a next step, and that's kind of parlaying to this other question, why do intrusive thoughts feel like they will happen? I have POCD thoughts and I'm so scared I will do something horrible. I think that's a great question, because it oftentimes reflects what people are deep down suffering with, who often may not be able to talk to their clinician about, or who may just want clarity on. Anyone would like to start off by answering that question?
Yeah, I can start. So I think that describing having OCD thoughts as it feels like it's going to happen, that's actually really kind of part and parcel of what it is to have OCD, because the thoughts that people have, like many thoughts people will have even without OCD, that they might have an intrusive thought that just kind of pops in, that, oh, maybe, what if I picked up these scissors and stabbed somebody? People without OCD, they have it, but they're pretty fleeting, and it doesn't really feel like it's going to happen. So it doesn't have the same kind of depth of emotional register that people with OCD experience. And so that is part of what is happening in the brains of people with OCD, is that it's not just that a thought comes in, but it's associated with intense feelings, and then immediately also associated with, I've got to prevent that from happening, or I've got to somehow figure out a way to stop feeling this way. So that it seems to be part of the neurobiology, and what we know about some of the neurobiology about OCD and some of the circuits that are involved in part of the prefrontal cortex and it's called the subcortical parts of the brain, that both of them seem to be involved in kind of registering that, oh, this might be like a real true threat of what's going on. So that's kind of in a simplified way what we know about the neurobiology of OCD and maybe why that's the case.
I've always looked at it along the lines of if you can ask two words, what if, and follow it by whatever might be the worst thing you could come up with, it will create enough of a fight, flight, or freeze response in you that you'll then think the only way I could ever feel the feelings that I just felt is if something really were a threat and actually were true. Otherwise, how could I have felt the deep feeling that I've ever had? So that's why people with OCD, when I work with them, often say to me, but it feels so real, right? Because of that fight, flight, or freeze response just being so massive. And, Jamie would, I think, go with this too, from an evolutionary biological point of view. The fight, flight, or freeze response is really designed to feel real and scare the crap out of us, right? It isn't designed for us to be like, take note of this, please, and why don't we write a little essay about it and think for a while about what might happen? No, it's designed to have us just get the heck out of there. So OCD triggering that makes you think, well, this thing must really be real if this is being triggered, because every other time this has been triggered in my life, like if a car's coming at me or if somebody's thrown something, they say, hey, 4 on a golf course. And, we don't sit and think about it. We just do. Well, OCD knows this. It triggers this. So therefore, it seems just as real as any other actual physical danger coming to us. So why not respond to it that way, just to make sure on the off chance, in case it were to happen, I keep myself or everyone around me safe from anything bad.
Right. And all I would add there, just to put a mindfulness spin, or first just a CBT spin to it, is there is a distortion of thought called emotional reasoning. In CBT, there are different ways that we can identify errors in our thinking. And with emotional reasoning, it's that if we feel things to be true and we believe them to be true just because we feel them. And that's a really important part of CBT, or the cognitive part of CBT, is to sort of be able to correct that, right? Just because I feel angry doesn't mean I'm going to explode, or just because I feel this way. Often this is very much the case for people who feel like they're having a difficult time differentiating between intuition and anxiety. But ultimately, we want to first look at that. And then from a mindfulness perspective, we want to be able to not just be able to observe thoughts, but to also be able to just note and be aware of, without judgment, feelings, sensations, urges, the whole gambit, because that's OCD. It will come, as they've said, in many different forms.
Yeah. And just a question that I have off of that too, just as somebody who has OCD, is a little bit curious too, is, I think it was a great question. How important is it to be self-compassionate when you have a lot of the intrusive thoughts? Because, I think, for example, like some of the more taboo ones that are sexual in nature or religious in nature or aggressive in nature, they can be somewhat scary, can make you question your values. How does self-compassion come into the treatment process?
Right. Can I take that?
That's you, Kim.
It's my favorite topic. I actually am a strong advocate for it always being the final icing on the cake of any type of treatment, specifically ERP. So the way that I like to do it is sort of, we make an ERP sandwich. We practice during the day being as compassionate as we can. When we're triggered, we will then intervene with the meat, which is ERP, the most important part of OCD treatment. And then if you can, the last piece is that self-compassion, which is, whatever discomfort you're feeling, the uncertainty you're feeling, the doubt that you're feeling, we would meet that suffering with kindness, with tenderness, instead of with criticism and harshness and this very, very tough like wrestle with it. So I really believe in the ERP sandwich, and I think that it does actually help for a really good ERP plan.
Yeah, that's definite. And I think especially those who are suffering with the intrusive thoughts, it's really applicable because, you know, it's they're tough, right? It's tough to feel that way. But I think if you find the right OCD specialist, right, that you could get help managing them in a way that Kim just described. And Patrick or Jamie, anything you'd like to add?
I just like to say to people, the issue isn't really whatever the thought is that pops into your head. It's the way that you react to it, right? So you can beat yourself up for having a certain thought, or you could take a look at, is my reaction going to help me, or is it getting in the way? And if it's getting in the way, let's work on that reaction. So we don't have to be mad or sad or angry or think we're bad or awful, horrible, disgusting, whatever, for the thoughts that pop into our head, because frankly, pretty much everyone has those thoughts. And I think Kim and Jamie, you would agree that we can leave a session with someone who has a lot of intrusive thoughts, and then we will then spend the rest of the day also wondering about those very same thoughts as well, too. I mean, I kind of joke that if I'm ever at the top of a staircase with any of you, I will think about pushing you down the stairs because I've treated that so many times that now I can't help but just consider launching anyone I'm next to down a flight of stairs. Now, I don't beat myself up over that because I can recognize that is just an intrusive thought and I can let that go. Yeah. So it's the reaction I think we have to look at, not necessarily the thought or the image or the urge itself.
Right. Yeah, and to add to that also, I think it's important for people with OCD to really understand what's going on with them, understand the illness, understand OCD. And OCD, it's really about, it's not so much about the content of your thoughts, even though it feels like it's all about the content. But the problem with OCD is not the content. The problem actually with OCD is what we call the process. So it's the process of having obsessive thoughts or having like a feeling that's intrusive and then doing some kind of behavior or avoiding to make it feel better. And then it just kind of returns in a cycle like that. And so I think that can be part of the self-compassion piece as well, because you know, you didn't ask for this problem in the first place. You didn't ask for this to be the content, but actually the content doesn't matter as much. You know, you have OCD, the content can be almost anything. It's the process that is really the main problem.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, I think that's a great point to understand, because OCD morphs, right? When you have different topics, you may have for several months one specific subject that really bothers you, but then as time progresses, you may have another one that ends up bothering you. And you know, people always ask me, how do you treat them differently? I'm like, well, talk to Patrick or Jamie. But I think in general, what I've learned from my own experience is that you have to apply the same points of acceptance, right, to each thought. And kind of going off of that, Ann K has a great question here. Radical acceptance, the great concept, but it feels dangerous and irresponsible sometimes. Tips for dealing with those feelings? Thanks for doing this. So just in general, anybody have an answer to Ann's question about radical acceptance?
Well, I would start by just noting that let's first start with acceptance, and then we'll move to radical acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean you agree with your thoughts. Acceptance doesn't mean you want them. Acceptance is I'm going to allow them to be in the space in which I exist in this present moment, right? So I think a lot of people misunderstand acceptance as, like, if I'm having a thought about harming someone, accepting it means that I want to, or accepting means that I'm okay with that type of behavior. And I think that it's really important that we look at acceptance as basically facing what's happening, like, again, non-judgmentally. Right now I'm having this thought, and that's what's happening. When we move to radical acceptance, that is a full body, bring it on, let's do it. I'm allowing myself to have the thought and I'm allowing it to come back and I'm committing to it for the rest of my life. That too does not mean you are pro-harming people. I think that the point there that we misunderstand is that we have to step back from trying to dissect what we do, especially in ERP, and try and figure out whether that makes us good or bad, or whether we could or we couldn't do this in the future. So it's stepping away from that analysis and just moving into being with what is.
Yeah, there's a danger in getting into the idea of thought police, that there's such a thing as a good thought or a bad thought, right? And OCD believes that it is thought police and that there are good thoughts to have, there are bad urges, there are bad images. Anyone who's been to a conference I've spoken at knows that I've got a card in my wallet for the last almost 20 years that says, I hope my parents die tonight, and they are still alive. So that's, you know, and I just wrote it one more time on a piece of paper, and I'll just leave it there too. So I put a little heart around it too, just to show the love of dying of my family. I will radically accept that I can have that thought, just as Kim said, and I will just be with it in the moment. I will not try to make it go away. And I will also know that I am not a Marvel superhero or a DC comic hero that has the ability, once I think something, to cause anything in the world to change based on the way that my mind processes something. So kind of like Jamie said earlier too, it's that processing piece that's really the key. That if I believe that somehow I can manifest things by thoughts, anything becomes possible, right? But I have no actual evidence of that being fact. So therefore, I will not be afraid of anything that pops into my mind.
Yeah, it's also important to with regards to acceptance is to remember that who we are is really not our thoughts. Our thoughts are not necessarily who we are, or at least I would encourage people to not think about who they are, like as a person, deep down inside, their values, as being directly reflective of any thought that they have moment to moment. So we can have many, many thoughts. Some of the thoughts are things that we identify with, that we like, that we think are a part of our values. But everybody has many, many other thoughts that are not part of that because we can't control what we think.
Yeah.
That goes for OCD, it goes for everybody else too.
Definitely.
Right. Can I just say one more thing? I think that any tool that we offer up today, I already know they'll all be correct and science-based and the ones that we need to use. But the thing I really would want to make sure everyone takes away from this session is our main goal with treatment is to be with and allow uncertainty. So even if you're practicing radical acceptance, but you're doing it wanting to get certainty that you won't, or you're doing some kind of tool, often I'll have clients do mindfulness, but I can kind of pick up when they're trying to do it in effort to make their discomfort go away, or they're trying to actually secure down certainty. So again, to come back with any of the tools that we bring up today, if they're done through the goal of getting certainty, they're not being used correctly.
Yeah, and so that goes for what I just said as well, is that I think it's important, and I believe that it's good to think about things that way, but it shouldn't be something that you should use as kind of a self-reassurance.
Yeah,
definitely. And Dr. Feusner, back to you here. So I think this is a good question in regards to some of the elements of psychiatry. So the question from Ali was, Dr. Feusner, you're a brain researcher, yes? Do you have any novel recommendations about things to do to deal with paroxetine withdrawal? It has ruined my life. I'm getting nowhere in OCD or depression treatment because it keeps making me go absolutely insane. I don't know how to get through it. There seems to be no recommendations of how to mitigate, but beside another SSRI. Wondering if you have any perspective there. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background on this, paroxetine is a medication. The trade name is Paxil, and its usual trade name. So it's a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Serotonin reuptake inhibitor medications are first-line treatments for OCD. So many people with OCD are on these medications, and they can be effective for many people. Sometimes people need to come off the medication for various reasons. So they might come off the medication because they're having bad side effects, or maybe it wasn't working that well and they need to switch to another one. or maybe they have gotten a lot better and they want to try to go off it to see they've been better for a couple of years and want to see if they're okay off of it, especially if they did exposure response prevention. Or sometimes people stop it abruptly kind of on their own without consulting with the doctor. So those are kind of the different ways that reasons why people might go off medication. And in a portion of people who go off medication, especially if they don't taper it very slowly, then they can get what's essentially kind of a withdrawal syndrome from it. And it doesn't happen to everybody, but it does happen to some. It's not uncommon, and for most people, it's relatively mild. Like it might feel a little bit like dizziness or a little bit of agitation, a little bit of nausea sometimes, and then typically that goes away after a few days or a week or a couple weeks. But there are some people that can have a more prolonged withdrawal, and even if they do it correctly by trying to taper very slowly, paroxetine actually seems to be one of the ones that has maybe the most difficult withdrawal of the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And so in some cases it can be really challenging, and people might have kind of prolonged symptoms even after they're off of it, and even after it's been many weeks, and in some cases maybe even a few months. So one of the ways that I'm typically of dealing with it, which I think was mentioned as well, is to go back on a very small dose of a different serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the usual one that we use is Prozac or fluoxetine at a very low dose, like 10 milligrams or so. And then fluoxetine or Prozac has a very long, what's called half-life, which just means that it stays in your system for a very long time and it kind of naturally tapers itself out. So it ends up being one that your body is able to have more time, your brain is able to have more time to adjust to like a slow decrease day by day. And that seems to be one of the best ways of dealing with it, is to do that.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Really, I think that's a great overview. And, I think it's great to understand too how the med management and psychiatric side of OCD treatment works. So kind of transitioning to a completely other end of the spectrum, Janine has a question. If we can't get access to therapy quickly and we don't want medication, any way to self-care to OCD, affirmations, meditation, etc. Either Kim or Dr. McGrath, would you like to answer that one?
Go ahead. Yeah, if you want to start. Yeah, I think some of the stuff that Kim's got going on with her CBT school would be a great place to start, looking at some of the great work that she's done and listening to the podcast that she's got with people. You did a great one with me, if I remember correctly. And Stuart Ralph's OCD stories. There's so much wonderful information out there and self-help books that people have written that people could get started on there. But I think really, and I like what Kim said earlier, and the self-compassion piece in this all too, that if people can accept that when they start therapy, they're probably going to feel worse before they get better, and not to run away from it because of that feeling. I often talk about, if anyone's ever had children and they decide tonight's the night they're going to put the kids to bed and not check on them, those kids are going to throw a tantrum like they've never thrown before because they're so used to it. And OCD is going to do the same thing too. So to allow for the natural progression of healing, which is often we feel worse before we get better, and to be open and honest and compassionate to ourselves, that we're going to allow ourselves to do that and utilize great tools like Kim's got out for everybody, I think would be very helpful as well.
Thank you. That's so sweet. I think to answer your question, I'm always going to encourage you to go straight to the science-based tools first. You mentioned self-care and affirmations, and I don't see the full question. Were there other options there, Stephen?
Oh, meditation.
Okay, yeah. So I would always go to the research, and we have a really good amount of research showing that, of course, ERP, but then also mindfulness and tools like acceptance and commitment therapy, which is short, we call it ACT. And these tools can help us to sort of practice in our daily life and to sort of strengthen this muscle within us of motivation and kindness. And again, like mindfulness, these are all really, really effective supplements to ERP that I would strongly encourage you to look into. There are some great ACT resources out there that are online as well. I have cbtschool.com, and that also has a bunch of free resources for people who are looking for self-care plans or mindfulness tools and so forth. And so they're out there. There are people who are out there offering up free services for people, and the really good ones are science-based. And so if you can follow that, you're on the right track.
Yeah. Just to add to that also, so they're part of the evidence-based treatments for OCD do include some internet CBT programs. And so they're in some countries, for example, in Sweden, this is actually offered, it's covered by the National Health Care. And there's a number of ones that are out there. There's one that is based specifically on a research study that was done by a group in Australia many years ago. It's called thiswayup.org.au, and they actually they're offering right now some of these tools that they have for free for people because of the COVID crisis.
Well, we also are biased here, especially Dr. McGrath, Dr. Feusner, and myself. But we also have the NOCD app too, where people can utilize some of the tools section to actually manage their OCD thoughts in the moment. For example, we have an SOS feature where you can hit it, and we help walk you through that episode, and we help you apply response prevention right in that moment. And so there's different tools like that as well, which you can start to integrate. But I think for the most part, what we really recommend is people go and try to find an OCD specialist therapist who can help them, get better, right? Because I think that's the most important part. And once you get better, you'll be empowered to help yourself stay better, and that's really important. So it's with OCD, it's chronic, and that's why you have to do really both. So kind of going down here with that, Valerian here at 5:15 p.m. asked, what is the most effective treatment for OCD, ERP or CBT? Or does a more Freudian approach, dissecting emotions of a person with OCD's past, work? But that's the question.
Well, from a research standpoint, exposure and response prevention is the mainline treatment. And then if you look at the American Psychiatric Guidelines, which Jamie would know, that plus medication are the two main recommendations from the American Psychiatric Association. So either ERP alone or ERP plus medication, those are going to be your front lines. You can definitely augment ERP excellently with cognitive behavioral therapy and some of the things Kim was talking about as well too. But in comparative studies, other types of therapies just don't seem to stand up as well to exposure and response prevention therapy.
Right. I'll just add my own personal experience, and this gets me super emotional. It's so painful for me to see a client or a patient who has been through years of talk therapy or analysis therapy and tons of money and tons of resources, only to find out that they were doing compulsions during the session with the clinician the whole time. And this, while I'm so grateful that they finally get to an ERP therapist, I really would hope that, particularly in colleges where clinicians are learning new tools, that they're understanding that the best tool for ERP, the most successful tool for OCD, is ERP. And that often when we do talk therapy, analysis, that kind of work, there is a lot of reassurance seeking happening and a lot of compulsive rumination happening in the room. And that's just the one thing to look out for if you are in that type of treatment.
Yeah, Jamie, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, and just to make sure, because there might be some people that are not clear about the distinction between CBT and ERP, because those two terms are brought up. So cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is kind of like a larger category of treatments as a type of psychotherapy. And exposure and response prevention is considered a subtype of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's a subtype that the evidence shows is particularly effective for people with OCD. There are some studies of people who have done the cognitive part of cognitive behavioral therapy alone for OCD. There aren't as many of those studies, but there's some suggestion that maybe in some cases that might be effective too. And the exposure and response prevention actually can be used for some other problems too. So it can be used for things like panic. In social phobia, we often use exposures, and phobias as well as another thing that we use ERP for. PTSD also uses many exposure techniques, especially something called prolonged exposure. So it's kind of similar to the exposures that we do with OCD.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think too, it's people oftentimes will go to see a therapist who may not know that ERP is the gold standard for OCD, and you may go there and you may come, ask somebody, what do I need to do to get better? And they may say, hey, take a rubber band and snap it on your wrist, right? And those are things to look out for, because oftentimes you need to see an OCD specialist who has that specialty training in OCD and ERP to get better. And so, I think that's an important point in the treatment journey, because oftentimes, like Kim mentioned, people will spend years going to an ineffective therapist who doesn't necessarily understand that what the patient's going through is OCD and how to treat them. So kind of with that, I think there's oftentimes questions that emerge throughout treatment, and there's oftentimes questions people get even after treatment. And I know one in particular that stood out was, one from Aaron here actually at 5:30, and he mentioned a question I still struggle with: if you are not your thoughts, then who are you? And I know that's something that is deep, but it's also something that is logical in some essence, because you are guided by your thoughts day to day. So, anybody have an answer to Aaron's question?
Well, if I'm my thoughts, then I'm a murderer, because when I was driving an hour and a half to work every day and contemplated at least 3 times on my drive just ramming my car into the person who had cut me off, then I'm a really bad person if that's the case. Or am I a person who has thoughts and who can also evaluate and let them go? Am I a person who's a family member? Am I a person who's a friend? Am I a person who does good deeds for the neighbor? Am I someone who does mundane tasks every day, like going shopping and takes the car in for an oil change? Am I a person who makes money by going to work and functioning that way? I'm so much more than just the thoughts that I have. I'm the things that I do. I'm the people I surround myself with. I'm the beliefs that I hold. I'm lots of things other than just the thoughts that pop into my head.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. And it's what you're saying, a lot of what you're saying is that who you are are your behaviors. Yeah. And I think this question is like, it's a deep philosophical question, but
right.
But I think in a way, I believe that who we are is mostly our behaviors. Mm-hmm. Our behaviors are the things that mean the most. They mean the most to other people around us. They mean the most to us. They're the things that get things done, that care for other people, demonstrate to other people that we want to help them or care for them, or that, so I think the behaviors are stronger than the thoughts in terms of who we are.
Right. One thing that, if this comes up in treatment or post-treatment, one thing, this is just an opinion, so I'm not going to back this with any kind of science, but one way I approach that is when someone is really wrestling with this idea of who am I, and they're having a hard time moving forward and they're very stuck on this, I always encourage them to lead with values, and that values can actually be a big piece of who we are as well. Yeah. The cool thing about that, and this is a component of acceptance and commitment therapy, we know as ACT, is that when we are also having a trigger, OCD, obsession, and intrusive thoughts, we can also then act through values as well. So it's a way of thinking in which we can apply to any part of your life. That when you're stressed, and as both Jamie and Patrick said, you don't know which direction to go, and the main work is that you stay functioning and you do a correct response. Sometimes we can just respond based on what do I value. So if you're triggered, you might say to yourself, okay, I'm triggered. I really want to do this compulsion. I'm really anxious. I really need to know the answer, but I really value my family. And so I'm going to sit down on the carpet and I'm going to play trucks, or whatever you're doing. So sometimes values can be of help when people are trying to navigate that question.
I did a group once, and I had a bunch of people who spent all sorts of time trying to convince each other that they were just awful, horrible people, every one of them having OCD. So I just wrote on the board everything that they all thought that they were. And by the end of it, I said, now, I'm either in the room with some of the most vile, awful, horrible people in the entire world, or I'm in a room full of people with OCD. which one am I in, right? And how many of you have been arrested for your thoughts versus how many of you have been arrested for your behaviors? That no one had been arrested for any of the behaviors that were on the board because no one had ever done them, but everyone thought they were a horrible person for having thought about doing them. So,
yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I feel like in some ways your behaviors are guided by your thoughts, like playing as the OCD patient, right? Like as a devil's advocate. So, if you're like, well, I live day to day and for 99% of my thoughts, or I act on 99% of my thoughts because that's how I function, right? So then why is this 1% different? And I think logically speaking, it makes sense. But then to Kim, your point, right? It sounds like the values, like you act on thoughts that coincide with your values. And typically, I think in this case, it's people with OCD have a rational reaction to some of the thoughts. And that's what, sometimes you can't even control. I mean, that's personally, I know that well from having some of the more taboo, intrusive thoughts, and it's tough, right? So it's a tough situation when you can understand that 99% of your thoughts are logical and rational, but then even though this 1% is irrational, it still bothers you as if it was rational. So
right. Can I just add one more thing? I think I want to bring up real quick. I think it's really important to know too that after you've completed ERP, you're going to have some pretty existential questions, right? Things after you've been terrorized by thoughts and hours of compulsions for many years or months of your life, these big questions can come up. And often they can be sort of an undertone of depression, right? That there's this sort of leftover, like, what do I do now? I've lost all these years. There's such grief there. And so sometimes it might be helpful to see a clinician to help with that depression that's left over.
That's a great point. And I think, Kim, that also parlays into another question here. What's the best way to handle setbacks during recovery in ERP?
You get back on the horse, right? I mean, if someone's been driving for 40 years and then gets in a car accident, most people will get back in a car and drive again. And for those who don't, they come to therapy so that they go back to doing the old behaviors that they were doing. So you really have to kind of recognize that setbacks and failures are a part of success. Very few people in the world we have any evidence of have been just successful there. I don't know anyone who's ever been 100% successful their entire life and just everything has gone well for them. They've had setbacks, they've had difficulties. And so that's what you do. You get back on the horse and you go back and you try it again.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jamie.
And just quickly that self-compassion, that it's okay. It happens to everybody. It happens to people with OCD. It's actually kind of to be expected when it comes up. I think that it's good to have that attitude that it's bound to happen at some point. So you don't necessarily need to overreact to it and just do what has worked for you before. If it doesn't work, then there are new strategies that you can always try, and you can get back in touch with your therapist.
Definitely. We have time for Kim,
that's exactly what I would have said. So.
Okay. we have time for a few more questions here. So I'm going to ask one that's a little bit more on the psychiatry side. From Miguel here at 533. Being in withdrawal from anxiety, depression, and drugs may produce or enhance the triggering of intrusive thoughts. Can we separate this withdrawal condition from the one that naturally happens, or both have to be treated the same way?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. It's really hard to tell, I think, when that occurs, because there are withdrawal symptoms that can happen, the medications like I described earlier, and then also when people go off medications sometimes. So actually there's kind of three things happen. One is that you could have those withdrawal symptoms. It's possible the withdrawal symptoms themselves might trigger some OCD thoughts or anxiety or a combination of that. And then it's also possible that coming off the medication may have been successfully treating some of those symptoms, that the symptoms themselves are just coming back because you don't have medication in your system. And it's almost probably impossible to really discern, like in any given moment, what's going on with that. So, the withdrawal, for most people, the withdrawal itself will go away after some time. So that's one way of figuring that out and dealing with it, is that, either doing like a different taper strategy or something, and then eventually getting to the point where that isn't happening. and you're not having a lot of those physical symptoms, then you might be able to see like what's more of the OCD maybe reemerging at that point. And then also at that time, you might not have the same triggers. So that's kind of like a wait and see kind of approach.
Yeah. Yeah. That's excellent. Thanks so much, Jamie. And here's another question. How do I engage in the conversation with my daughter who has OCD and insists on having answers to unlogical things, but tends to find some justification for them for reassurance? So involving the family. So now we have some folks here who are listening in hopes of helping a loved one. Kim or Dr. McGrath, anything you'd like to answer with here?
Yeah, I mean, it's been exciting for us, especially with NOCD launching our child and adolescent protocol and focusing on this so much recently, where you don't do therapy with just the child is our big suggestion. You have to have the family involved too, because the intertwining of the reassurance giving along with the reassurance seeking, and you have to really work on breaking that mold. So OCD is a really tricky thing, and it will find any nugget of truth that it possibly can in any possible statement or consequence or situation that it could possibly do, and then say, see, I told you, look at this one thing, which is related to that, to that, to that, which roundabout comes to that or whatever. And it's not playing the game with OCD, but just getting to a point of being able to stand up to OCD and say, listen, I'm not going to have this discussion. We're not going to play this game. This is not worth our time. We know that when we go down this rabbit hole, it just ends in us arguing and having a really bad night. So here's what I'm going to say, and that's what I'm going to say, and that's it. And we're going to have to sit with that, and that's going to be what it is.
Excellent. Excellent. Kim, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I would add to that, because I think that's perfect, is, with that, we don't want them to be a source of compulsion, right? So you don't want your family members to do compulsions for you, and we don't want to do compulsions for our family members, but we can offer support, and we can offer them a moment of compassion, because the voice of OCD is very, very mean, and can at that age very much like put a narrative in their head of like how bad they are and they're just a mess and that they're, all of the thoughts. And so what we can offer to our family members is support and then a boundary. So it might be, I love you, but I'm not engaging with OCD, or honey, I will always be here for you, but I will not be there for OCD to take over your life. So sometimes just softening the message can still mean that they've got a narrative and a voice in their mind that they're still worthy of being treated kindly, while also setting very strong boundaries against OCD.
And if I could add, parents have to also recognize that when their kids get very angry at them because they're not giving in to everything OCD wants, that it's the OCD lashing out at the parents. And so many times children will come up later and say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that, and all those things, that OCD really tries to take over and just become an awful, horrible being just to try to get what it wants. Because OCD doesn't care if it offends anybody else. It just wants to be satisfied at the bottom line.
Yeah, definitely. One question here that I think is actually an interesting one to end on is from Jonas, and he asks, are you familiar with the Bergen 4-day treatment? And so I know there's obviously a lot of new research coming about in different treatment programs to help administer care. Any thoughts on the Bergen 4-day treatment?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the Bergen 4-day treatment. So the Bergen 4-day treatment is exposure response prevention. So first of all, it's a treatment that we've been talking about in a lot of this webinar, but it's done in a very condensed way. So it's done over the course of 4 days rather than doing it over the course of maybe a few weeks as a typical intensive treatment program would do. And so, it involves obviously, many hours of doing exposure throughout the day, really preparing patients ahead of time for doing it, doing exposures like in the homes a lot of times and in places where they're typically being triggered. And so this was started in Bergen, is a city town in Norway. It was started by a group there at the university, and then and now it's become a treatment in Norway that most, my understanding is actually all of the OCD clinics now do it that way there as well. And then they're doing some testing in other countries, including the United States right now, to see if it can be applicable to other countries, other healthcare systems, patients, cultures, things like that.
I think high level, the overall mission is to get people better as fast as possible, right? I think every single person that has love and support for the OCD community will say that, right? Our goal in OCD is to get people better as fast as possible and then help people stay better. And so I think from a high level, right, there's a lot of providers out there. There are a lot of providers out there who are focused on getting people better and as fast as possible. And I think with technology and new research, there's going to be a lot more innovation in that, right? Where we're going to start to see more and more methodologies to get people better as fast as possible. And if we can do that, then we can make a long-term impact because there are tremendous resources that can then help us stay better, right? And so it's a big mission for us at NOCD, and thanks to Dr. Feusner and Dr. McGrath for leading that charge. And then, I've just from the many amazing conversations I've had with Kim and about CBT school as well as her own private practice in Calabasas, I mean, she definitely has that same mission as well, right? And so I think it's important to understand now we're entering into a new phase of OCD treatment. We're entering into a world where we can utilize technology to do teletherapy. We can utilize podcasts to listen to. We can go in and use digitized self-help books. We can, listen to an audiobook on exposure response. There's so many different modalities that we can incorporate into our day-to-day. And so I think, and kind of as we go forward here, it's important for us to realize that and to take advantage of, right? Because people with OCD don't deserve to suffer, right? And I think now we have something that is tangible that we can utilize, which we may not have had 5 years ago. And that's this kind of collection of resources. So with that, I just want to thank each and every one of you on the panel today for joining us. I'd love to thank Made of Millions for hosting this incredible series. And if you all have any more questions, please feel free to email us at NOCD at info@nocdhelp.com. And then Kim has a great Instagram account. And I know you've mentioned in the past you take questions there as well as through your own email. And Kim, I'm so sorry, I forgot your email off the top of my head, but
no, that's okay. So you can get me on at thecbtschool@gmail.com.
Perfect. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. All right. Take care.
Thanks for all the great questions. Bye.